Okay, our drums and bass are down, sounding really hammering, really nice. So now we're going to move on to the synths. Rather than writing a pattern here on the keyboard or on push, I'm going to try and create this entirely generatively. So using Live's MIDI devices and a bit of Max for Live probably, to get some really kind of randomly generated patterns that give that kind of computery, non-human feel that kind of suits this sort of music. So first of all, I'm going to make a new MIDI track and drop wavetable on it. So if we go into instruments here and wavetable. So just to get things started, I'm going to move the oscillator slider here, the wavetable slider, to just a saw wave, and bring this release down a bit. So we're going to work on that a bit more in due course, but to start with, we're just going to have that very simple, basic, buzzy saw wave thing as our start point. The first thing I'm going to add in here is an arpeggiator. So if we go to MIDI effects, we can drop the arpeggiator in at the start of the chain here, and you'll hear that now if I hold a note down, we'll get a sequence of notes. Let's change that to 16ths so that we get a faster sequence. So that gives us a start point. That's from just a held note, that's now generating some stuff for us. So I'm just going to quickly find out what we think the root note for this wants to be. So I'm just going to play, I'm going to solo the kick and the bass because they're the only elements that have got any real tuning to them. And I'm just going to have a little play around on the keyboard to find where the sweet spot is for the root of our sequence. So it sounds like it's there, to be honest. Again, it is not a particularly musical thing, and this is going to be very atonal anyway, but it's good to just get the centre point right. So that's B flat. So I'm just going to draw a big long note in on A sharp, B flat. So now we're just playing one MIDI note. The arpeggiator is generating a sequence of notes out of that. So we now need to make that interesting, and we need to add the kind of random factor to it. So firstly, I'm going to make our arpeggiator move around a little bit more in pitch. So I'm going to change steps there to 1, which means that it'll actually bounce around between 2 octaves. So a bit more movement, but still pretty boring and certainly not very random. So I'm now going to add the random device, which takes the incoming MIDI from the arpeggiator and applies various random things to it. So chance determines how much. If you have chance at 0, it stays the same. So now this is what the probability is of something random happening to those notes that come in. So you can see now this little indicator saying that when the little plus light is up, it's pitching the incoming note up by a random amount, 1 of 12 possible choices. When it's on 0, it's the original pitch. When it's on plus, it's the new pitch. So as you can see, it's always either 0 or plus. We can change that though, so that's this area here. So add, subtract, or bidirectional. So you can hear that starting to sound a bit more random now. This is the number of possible notes that it can be. So you can reduce that down to make it a little bit more predictable. Kind of not exactly musical, but a little bit less unpredictable, which sounds quite good, I think. So then the scale control is kind of a multiplier. So I'll just turn that up as things are playing so you can hear what it does. It kind of multiplies things up, so it means that the high ones become really high, the low ones become really low. So adding sort of between 1 and 4 is probably a sensible range to do that, unless you want some really, really crazy high and crazy low notes. do a little bit of work on the sound. We're still not there yet, but I'm going to kind of go to and fro between the synth and the random MIDI bits and kind of develop them both in parallel. So let's get the sound a little bit more interesting first. So let's get a bit of filter envelope on there. So bring our frequency down. Just going to solo the synth so we can just hear what we're doing. Going to go to the mod matrix and bring up envelope 2's amount for the filter frequency. Go to envelope 2. So that gives us more of a plucked kind of sound, which is a bit more interesting already. But it's still quite nice, it's still quite polite. So I'm going to get a second oscillator on the go. So we've got just oscillator 1 here is just our saw wave. Oscillator 2 I'm going to set to the same thing. But we're going to detune it quite a lot. So with the detune control you can go up or down 50 cents. So you can go half a semitone up or down. Which sounds quite detuned, but let's even go a bit further. So let's go down a whole semitone. And then back up a little bit. So we're kind of like 75s down there from the original pitch, which sounds really noisy and atonal. But for what we're doing here, that's kind of what we want, I think. So starting to get there now, starting to get a bit of a feel of that kind of, you know, random, very computery, kind of inspired by a lot of the modular sequencer type stuff that that many people use these days, but doing that same idea within software. The next thing we want to do, I think, is to add a bit of variation in the filter between different notes. So we would do that with velocity. So if we had a MIDI part, we could just edit the velocity manually, but obviously we're generating all this. So we're going to get the velocity MIDI effect in. Drop that in here. And you'll notice that it has got a random knob on it. So if we turn that up, that will start adding some random variation to the velocity of the notes coming through it. But we need to assign the velocity to something first. So back onto the synth, back onto wavetable, into the MIDI page, and we'll put velocity, which is here, to filter frequency. So you can hear now that's got a lot more texture going on. It's a lot more interesting because each note, as well as being kind of a random pitch, it's got a random velocity and therefore a random filter position on it as well. So it's suddenly starting to sound very alive and very interesting. But the rhythm does sound quite predictable at the moment. It's just straight 16ths. Every note's the same in terms of length, which is kind of a little bit boring. So we're going to add another MIDI device in here, which is note length. So I'll put that here after velocity. And if we just adjust this, you'll be able to hear what it does. So you can hear that adjusting this control changes the note length. So far, so simple, but we kind of want that to move around randomly, you know, like the other things have been doing, which we can't do, unlike the random device and the velocity device, which has got a random knob on it. There's no way within this device of making the note length be random. So we're going to have to turn to Max for Live here. So if we go into our Max for Live bits here, Max MIDI effect and LFO MIDI, we can drop that in anywhere in the chain, doesn't matter where. And we're going to map this LFO to the length here. So I'm going to click map and then click there. And you can see that now this LFO is controlling that parameter. Bring the rate down, and you can see more clearly what it's doing. As this wave moves up and down here, it's moving the length up and down here. So that's the right idea, but again, it's a bit too predictable. So let's change the LFO wave to random. Bring the rate up a little bit. And you can see that's now kind of doing a slightly different thing. smooth knob there, just as you can see, smooths the waveform out rather than making it all square. So that's starting to sound a lot more crazy and quirky and interesting now. So back to the synth, let's do a little bit more tinkering over here. So let's try putting it in mono mode so that we don't get any overlap between the notes. So making it monophonic there has meant that we don't get the sections where the notes are overlapping each other. And a little bit of glide means that when the notes do overlap each other, they kind of bend between each other, which again just adds a bit more weirdness and a bit more wonkiness to it. So I'm going to play that over the groove and see what we've got. I'm going to thicken the synth up slightly, make it a bit stereo with some unison. So I'm going to put the classic unison mode on and just 2 voices. So that just takes 2 copies of that synth, detunes them a bit and pans them left and right. So that just gives us a bit of stereo width and a bit of, yeah, just a bit more thickness to that synth.